My name is Kurt, and I am the man who held a woman's head in a stainless pan for 9 days while the sky outside kept screaming. I should say first that I was not always a lab hand. Before the blockade closed over our colony like a lid on a jar, I had been a combat engineer with the 2nd Frontier Sappers, and I had the arm to prove it, meaning the arm I no longer had. A Vrith feeder took it off above the elbow on a road outside our last standing town, and I lay in the dust beside the wreck of a half-track for 2 hours watching the stump cook in the heat before a medic found me. The medic was a younger man named Bill Courtner. He was not yet the doctor he would become. He was barely a surgeon then, but he tied off what was left of me with field thread and a tourniquet of webbing, and on the long crawl back to the wire he told me in that careful voice of his that he intended one day to fix the dead the way other men fixed engines. I thought it was the morphine talking. I should have known better. Bill Courtner never said anything he did not mean. I owed him my life, what was left of it, and so when the war ground us down into a colony of locked doors and rationed light, when the Vrith blockade closed the orbit and cut our supply lines, when the city above ground emptied out and the field hospitals were folded down into bunkers, I followed him underground. He set up his lab in a buried magazine 3 levels below the old munitions depot, and he asked me to be his assistant, and I said yes because there was nothing else left for a one-armed sapper to say. His father, old William Courtner, came down sometimes in the elevator and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and looked at his son like a man looking at a fire he had started by accident. William was a surgeon too, the old kind, the kind who closed a chest and prayed. He did not approve of Bill's work. He said so, quietly, in the way old men say important things. He used the word abomination once in my hearing, and Bill did not even turn around. Bill was already past listening by then. You have to understand what the Vrith were before I can tell you what we did to one of them, and what one of them did to her. They were not men. They were not even animals in any sense we had a word for. They were chitin and wet light, segmented things the size of a cargo hauler, with a forest of small mouths along the underside and 2 great curved cutting jaws at the front that they used to open hulls and ribs with the same indifference. They moved in a hive sense. What one knew, the others knew within the hour, and they did not eat the way we ate. They harvested. A Vrith feeder would crack a human body open at the sternum and pull the living organs out one at a time and store them in the wet pouch behind its head, while the donor was still alive enough to feel it. They believed, as far as our xenologists could ever tell, that a body was not dead until it stopped screaming. A still corpse was waste to them. A screaming one was meat. That was the part of their biology that broke our men more than the killing did. You could die in their grip and they would keep working on you because, by their logic, you had not yet finished dying. I saw a sergeant of mine, a man named Bressler, take 4 hours to go quiet under one of them on the road to Falter Creek. I will not describe what came out of him in that time. I will only tell you that when the relief column finally arrived and put a plasma round through the feeder, the Vrith dropped him half-finished, and the medics could not tell where Bressler ended and the harvest began. That was the enemy. That was the sky above our bunker. That was the reason Bill Courtner stopped sleeping. His fiancée Jan died on the road from the upper hospital to the bunker. The road was supposed to be cleared. It was not. A Vrith scout came down out of the cloud cover and clipped the transport, just a glancing blow with one of its forelimbs, not even a real strike, and the transport rolled 3 times into the ditch and Jan went out through the windscreen. Bill was driving. Bill walked away with a cut on his forehead. Jan he carried back to the bunker himself, 2 miles in the open on foot, with the wreckage of her below the collarbone wrapped in his coat and her head, somehow still alive, somehow still warm, cradled against his chest like a child. The Vrith scout did not follow. We never knew why. Perhaps it had eaten that day. Perhaps it was already moving on to the next column. Perhaps it knew, in the way the Hive knew things, that what Bill was carrying back to us was already its kind of meat. I was at the bunker door when he came in. I remember the noise his boots made on the ramp. I remember the way his father William stood up from his chair without saying anything. I remember Bill setting the bundle down on the prep table and unwrapping it, and I remember Jan's eyes opening, and I remember her looking at him, and I remember her trying to speak with no lungs to push the air. I remember thinking, very clearly, that no one in the colony but Bill could have brought her back even this far. I also remember thinking, in the next breath, that he should not have. Both of those thoughts came in the same second. I have not been able to separate them since. We put her in the pan that night. That is what we called it after the pan. It was a shallow stainless basin we had used for tissue washes, and Bill drilled it and ported it and ran the lines into the base of her neck where the cut had gone clean. He had been working toward this for 2 years. He had test rigs in the back room with animal tissue kept alive on his serum, mice brains that still twitched in their saucers when you walked past, a dog's head that had blinked at me once, and I had not gone back into that room for a week after. The serum was his life's work. He had built it for a quiet day, for a peacetime lab, for a long, careful approach to the problem of what death actually was. Instead, he used it that night, in a hurry, on a woman he loved, and the serum did what he had built it to do. It would not let her go. By dawn, Jan Compton was breathing through a machine and looking at us out of a face the color of wet paper, and she was awake, and she was aware, and she was screaming without sound because her vocal cords had not yet reconnected to the bellows Bill had rigged below the pan. He worked on her throat for 16 hours straight. He did not eat. He did not drink. I brought him water and he set the glass down beside the rig and forgot about it. When she finally found her voice again, the first thing she said was, "Let me die." Bill said no. Said no kindly. He said no the way a man says no to a child who wants something dangerous. He stood over the pan with his hands behind his back and he told her he would build her a new body. He told her he would take her out of that basin and into a whole woman again. He told her he loved her and that love was a kind of work and the work was not finished yet. Jan looked at him for a long time before she answered. Then she said in a voice like a dry hinge, "Bill, there are no spare bodies. There is a war on." He smiled at her. I have thought about that smile for a long time since. It was not a mad smile. It was the smile of a man who had already decided. "There are bodies," he said. "I will find one." And then he turned and went upstairs to find one. I want to be honest about what I was in those weeks. I was not a good man. I was a maimed engineer in a hole in the ground with a woman's head talking to me from a basin, and my arm itched where it was not, and the sky outside kept up its slow, low scream of the Vrith blockade, and I did what Bill told me to do because Bill had pulled me out of a ditch once, and because there was nowhere else for me to be useful. I fed Jan. I changed her lines. I cleaned the basin. I checked the seal on her bellows 3 times a shift because Bill had told me to, and because the seal was a fiddly piece of work, and because the alternative, her drowning slowly in her own static air, was something I could not stop thinking about. When her eyes followed me across the room, I tried not to flinch. When she asked me to kill her, I told her I could not. When she asked me why, I told her the truth, which was that Bill was a better man than me, and I would not undo his work even if I thought I should. She stopped asking after the 3rd day. She started talking to the door of the back room instead. The bunker in those days was a very specific kind of silence. We were 3 levels below the surface. The ventilation ran through a stack that climbed up through 40 feet of rockcrete and old munitions baffling, and by the time the air reached us, it was warm and dry and tasted faintly of rust. The lights were on a closed circuit running off the bunker's own cell, and the cell was old. And the lights flickered on a 4-second cycle that you stopped noticing after the first week, and then never stopped seeing again once a man pointed it out to you. The walls sweated in places. There was a low constant hum from the freezers in the back room, and a higher steadier hum from the pump that kept Jan's serum moving, and underneath both of those there was the bunker itself, which is to say, the slow settling of a structure that had been built in a hurry for a different war. I knew every noise of that room. I knew when the pump was running rich. I knew when the freezer behind the partition had cycled. I knew the sound of Bill's boots on the ramp from 20 feet of corridor away, and I knew the sound of his boots when he was carrying something he did not want me to see. A bunker teaches you to listen the way a forest teaches a hunter to listen. There is nothing else to do down there but learn the room. Jan learned it faster than I did. She had nothing to look at but the ceiling. She had nothing to do but listen. After the second day she could tell me, without turning her eyes, who was standing in the doorway and what they were carrying. After the fourth day she could tell me before I had heard it myself, when the thing in the back room had shifted on its haunches. She did not call it the thing. She did not call it anything. She just knew where it was at all times, the way a woman knows where her child is in a crowded room, without having to look. I have not told you yet about what was in the back room. I should. 2 months before Jan, when the upper hospital was still standing, Bill had received a delivery. It came down the elevator in a steel coffin lined with cold plates, and he and I unloaded it ourselves because he did not want anyone else to see. Inside the coffin was a Vrith. A small one, a juvenile, our xenologist would have called it, no bigger than a man, but a Vrith all the same, chitin and slow wet breath, and those 2 great curved jaws folded back against its head. It had been brought in alive from a downed scout wreck, and turned over to medical research before the blockade closed and cut us off from the universities. Bill had taken delivery in the chaos. Bill had signed the papers himself. The thing in the coffin should have been studied by a team of 50 in a clean room on a clean world. Instead, it ended up in the back room of a buried magazine on a dying colony, locked behind a hatch, kept alive on Bill's serum because Bill was not a man to let a specimen die when he had only just gotten his hands on it. I called it the thing because I would not give it a name. Bill called it nothing at all. He treated it the way a butcher treats a side of meat, with respect for its dimensions and no respect for its person, and he had spent the weeks before Jan's accident cutting into it and pulling things out of it and stitching them back indifferently. He was trying to learn the trick of how the Vrith kept their tissue alive past what should kill it. He thought the answer was in their chitin, in the slow wet sap that ran under their plates, in the way they would not die on a human schedule. He was right about that. He just had not yet understood what he was teaching the thing in return. Because the thing was learning, I knew it before Bill did. I would walk past the hatch with a tray and I would hear it breathing on the other side, and the breath had a rhythm to it that was not a Vrith rhythm. It was matching mine. It was learning the cadence of a human in a corridor. When I stood still, it stood still. When I walked, it walked. Once I sang under my breath, an old sapper's song my unit used to sing on the road, and the thing in the back room hummed 2 bars of it back to me through the hatch in a voice like wet stone. I did not sing again after that. Jan started talking to it on the 4th day. I do not know how she knew it was there. We had not told her. The hatch was closed and the back room was sealed, and there was no line of sight from the pan on the prep table to the door of the room where the thing lived. But she knew. She would turn her eyes, and only her eyes, because the bellows did not let her turn her head toward that door, and she would talk in a low voice, and after a while the door would shift on its hinges as the thing on the other side leaned its weight against it to listen. I asked her once what they talked about. "Pain," she said. "We are the only 2 things down here that understand it from the inside." I did not have an answer for that. I asked her later in the dark of one of those long shifts how they were talking. She could not see through the door. The thing did not have a human throat. I had heard it hum back at me once, and that was all. Jan turned her eyes toward me. They were dark by then, all pupil. The serum had done something to the iris, and she said, "It is not talking. It is feeling. It is on the Hive sense, Kurt. The serum is the same. The serum is the bridge. When I am afraid, it is afraid. When I want, it wants. We are the same animal now, in the parts that matter." She said it without any particular weight, the way she might once have remarked on the weather. I went and sat on the floor by the elevator for 10 minutes after, with the stump of my arm aching, and I tried to decide whether to tell Bill. I did not tell him. I told myself I did not want to interfere with his work. The truth was that I was afraid of what he would do if he knew. I was afraid he would try to cut the thing open while it was still listening to her. I was afraid he would try to cut her open to see how the listening worked. By that point I was afraid of Bill in ways I had not yet admitted to myself. The pan had changed him, or it had revealed him. I am still not sure which. Bill was gone from the bunker more and more in those days. He had told Jen he would find her a body, and he meant it. He went up into what was left of the city above us. The colony's capital, half emptied, what we had once called Marston, but which by then everyone called the Ash, because that was mostly what it was. The Ash was where the holdouts lived. The Vrith had not put a foot in the upper city in 8 months. The blockade was an orbital matter, not a ground one, on our colony at least. But the upper city had emptied anyway, because there was no food coming in, and no medicine coming in, and no off-world traffic, and a great many people had decided that if they were going to starve they might as well do it somewhere with running water. So the Ash had been left to the kind of people who could not or would not leave. There were 3 bars still open on the high street. There was a dance hall on the corner of what had once been St. Mark's. There was a woman who called herself Lady Marmalade who ran a back room above the dance hall, and who would, for a fee, find you anything in the colony that could still be found. Bill went to all of them. He came back with stories of women he had met. He laid the stories out for me in the lab the way an engineer lays out spec sheets. A dancer named Doris who had a body like a statue and a mind too tired to ask the right questions. He had watched her one night at the dance hall and had stood at the bar and bought her drinks and told her he was a doctor with a private clinic in the lower levels. She had been polite. She had been bored. She had not been suspicious. He had measured her against Jan in his head, and he told me in the lab that Doris would do, that her bone structure was close enough, that the join at the neck would take. He used the word join. He said it the way he had once said suture. He was no longer translating in his head between the medical and the butchers. There was no longer a difference for him. A pilot named Roxanne who had grounded herself when the blockade closed and now drank in a basement off the old aerodrome. He had gone to her because someone in the dance hall had mentioned her. Roxanne was harder. Roxanne asked questions. Roxanne had been a combat pilot in the early war and had killed Vrith scouts from the air and had been written up for it, and she was not the kind of woman who took a strange man's offer at face value. Bill came back from Roxanne irritated and impressed in roughly equal measure, and he told me she was off the list. Then a week later he told me she was back on it. He had thought about her arms, he said. Pilot's arms. Hard arms. Arms that would do for the work Jan would need to do once she was whole again. He had stopped seeing Roxanne as a woman by then. He had started seeing her as arms. A medic named Donna who had lost her hospital and her purpose with it. Donna was the saddest of them, in his telling. Donna had been one of his classmates, years before, and she had stayed in the colony when most of her cohort had shipped out. And she had been at the upper hospital when it took the cutting beam, and she had walked out of the rubble with no patients left to tend. Donna drank in the Ash now. Donna drank a great deal. Bill said she would be the easiest. Bill said it the way another man might have said he was sorry. He was sorry. I want that on the record too. He was, in some twisted residual way, still sorry about the people he was sizing up. He just did not let the sorry stop him. I did not stop him. I want to say that I did, on the record, for whoever reads this. I did not. I told myself that he had not yet done anything, that he was only looking, that perhaps he would never bring one of them down the elevator. I told myself that as long as I cleaned the pan and fed Jan and kept the lights on, I was not party to it. I told myself that a one-armed sapper who owed his life to the surgeon was not the right man to hold the surgeon to account. I told myself a great many things in those days. None of them held up. On the 6th day, a man came down to the lab who should not have been able to find it. His name was Mancini, and he was a detective with what was left of the colony's civil security. There were not many of him left. Civil security had folded into military police 6 months into the blockade, and what was left of the detectives had been moved into missing persons, because there was a great deal of missing person work in a city that was slowly dying. And he had walked down the elevator on his own, without an appointment, with a notebook in his hand and his hat pushed back on his head. And he stood in the doorway of the lab and he looked at me for a long moment before he said anything. He was a small man. He had a mustache and tired eyes. He had taken the trouble to wear a tie under his field jacket. I have always remembered that about him. He said, "Mr. Kurt, I am looking for Dr. Kortner." I said the doctor was not in. I said it pleasantly. The pan was behind a partition. The things hatch was closed. The back room was sealed. Mancini could not see anything from the doorway except the prep table and the cabinets and the elevator. He could not see Jan. He could not hear her either because Bill had taught her to be quiet when the buzzer sounded at the elevator, and Jan was a quick study about such things. She had been quick about everything from the start. Mancini nodded. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway and he looked at the cabinets the way a man looks at a wall when he is deciding what is on the other side of it. Then he said, "3 women have gone missing from the high street in the last 2 weeks. A dancer, a pilot's friend. Your doctor's name has come up at 3 different bars in connection with all 3 of them." I said I did not know anything about that. Mancini looked at me. He had the kind of eyes that did not press. They just waited. He said, "Mr. Kurt, I have read your file. I know who you were before the war. I know who you were after Falter Creek. I do not think you are a man who came down into a hole in the ground to help with murders." He paused. He pushed his hat back a little further. "I think you came down here for a doctor who pulled you out of a ditch. I think you are the kind of man who pays his debts. I respect that, I do. But there is a point past which a debt becomes a thing you are doing on someone else's behalf, and I think you are close to that point, and I think you have not yet looked at it square." I did not say anything. He nodded as if I had said a great deal. He said, "I am not going to come in. I am not going to bring a warrant. The colony does not have warrants anymore. The colony does not have most things anymore. I am only going to tell you that I know. I am going to tell you that other people will start to know. I am going to tell you that when the doctor comes back you should look at his hands and ask yourself what they have been doing while you were down here. And then I am going to leave." He left. I stood at the elevator and watched the indicator climb back up to the surface. I went back into the lab. Jan was looking at me. She had been listening. She had heard every word. She said, "He is right, you know." I said I knew. She said, "Then why?" I did not have an answer. I have been trying to find one ever since. I should tell you, while I am being honest, that the ash was getting worse by then. The blockade had been on for almost 2 years, and the Vrith were not letting up, and the food rations in the upper city had been cut to nothing, and the dance hall on St. Mark's had stopped serving anything stronger than ration alcohol, because the real liquor had all been drunk. Lady Marmalade had taken to selling her own stores at 3 times the pre-war price. The pilot Roxanne had stopped flying drunk and started flying serious, in the way a pilot does when she has finally accepted that the next sortie is the one she does not come back from. The dancer Doris had started taking on private clients because the dance hall could no longer pay her. Donna the medic had stopped going outside in daylight because she could not bear to see what the upper city had become. All of these women were carrying their own kinds of weight, and Bill knew it, and Bill counted on it. He counted on the fact that no one in the ash was looking very hard for anyone else. He counted on the fact that the Vrith were a better story than he was, and that any missing person could be written off as a casualty of the war the colony had stopped properly noticing. I went up to the ash once in those weeks, on an errand of Bill's I did not particularly want to run. He needed a bottle of a particular medical-grade alcohol that the bunker no longer stocked, and Lady Marmalade kept a case of it in the back room above the dance hall, and Bill was busy that night with the rig and could not go himself. I rode the elevator up to the surface and walked the 4 blocks to St. Mark's with my coat collar turned up against a wind that smelled of burned cable, and I had not been on the upper street in 5 months, and I did not recognize it. The buildings I remembered had not fallen mostly, but the people in them had. The lights in the windows were the wrong kind of yellow, the kind a man burns when he is rationing his last bulbs. The dance hall on the corner was open but quiet, and the band was down to a single tired horn and a brushed drummer, and Lady Marmalade herself met me at the back stair. She was a tall woman of indeterminate age with a gold tooth, and a way of looking at a man's pockets before she looked at his face. She took my money and gave me the bottle and asked me, on her own initiative, how the doctor was. I said the doctor was well. She held my gaze for a beat longer than the answer required. Then she said, "You tell him my girls are not for sale this season. Tell him I will not take his calls. Tell him whatever quiet clinic he is running in the lower levels, he can run it without my catalog." I said I would tell him. I did not tell him. I went back down the elevator with the bottle and I set it on his bench, and I did not pass the message. I should have. That is another of the small things I should have done and did not, and the small things added up, the way they always do. Mancini was the exception. Mancini had still been looking. Mancini had walked down the elevator and put his finger on the place that hurt. I did not tell Bill that Mancini had come. I should have. That is another thing I will live with. I told myself I would tell him in the morning. I told myself I would tell him when he was rested. I told myself 100 ways to delay it, because I knew, in the part of my head I was not yet listening to, that if I told him he would move faster, that he would skip the careful courtship and go straight to the body, and I did not want to be in the lab on the night he did. So I did not tell him. And Bill, who had not slept a full night in 3 weeks, made his decision on his own. What broke the spell in the end was the thing. It happened on the 9th day, and I will tell you exactly how, because I have not been able to stop telling myself. Bill had come down that morning with a woman in tow. Her name was Doris. She was the dancer. He had told her he was a doctor and that he had a private clinic in the lower levels and that he would pay her for her time. She had come because she was tired and because the colony was dying and because a quiet room with a doctor in it sounded like a thing she could survive. She walked down the elevator on her own 2 feet. She made a joke about the smell. Bill laughed lightly, the way he laughed when he wanted a thing to be at ease. He sat her down on the prep table. He poured her a glass of the clear ration alcohol we kept in the cabinet. He put something in the glass when she was not looking. I watched him do it. I did not stop him. I will live with that. Doris drank the glass and she sagged on the table, and Bill caught her gently and laid her down and looked at me across her body and said, in the same quiet voice he used for everything, "Kurt, prep the rig." I went to prep the rig. I want to tell you that I was going to refuse. I want to tell you that the words were already in my throat. But what happened next made the question of my throat irrelevant, because while I was standing at the rig with my one hand on the strap, and Bill was standing over Doris with the scalpel, Jan started screaming. She had a voice by then. We had given her a voice. The bellows pushed air through her cords on demand, and when she screamed the sound came out flat and metallic and louder than a basin head had any right to be. She was screaming at Bill. She was screaming the word no. She was screaming it the way a woman screams who has waited 9 days for the chance. And the thing in the back room screamed with her. It hit the hatch, not the way a man hits a door, the way a falling girder hits a floor. The hatch was 1.5 inches of military plate steel, set into a frame of poured rockcrete, and the thing hit it once and the frame moved in the wall. It hit it twice and the hinges began to scream. It hit it a 3rd time and the hatch came off the frame and slid 4 feet across the floor of the back room and landed flat with the thing standing on top of it. And the thing was not the size it had been when we put it in there. The thing had grown. The serum, Bill's serum, the same serum that kept Jan alive in her pan, had been keeping the thing alive too, and the thing had been using it. The thing was now 9 feet tall and the wrong shape, and patched in a dozen places with skin that was not Vrith chitin. The thing was wearing pieces of the experiments Bill had done on it. The thing was wearing pieces of Bill's failures. The thing's left arm was the arm Bill had been trying to graft onto Kurt, onto me, in the test runs, in the simulations. And the thing's jaw was hinged with human ligament Bill had spliced in to teach the Vrith plates to flex like ours. The thing was a monster Bill had built without meaning to, out of bits and pieces of his own dead ends, and Jan had been talking to it for 9 days, and now Jan had called it, and it had come. It went for Bill. Bill turned with the scalpel still in his hand. He had time for one word. I do not know what the word was. The thing took him through the ribs with the great curved jaws. Bill had spent 2 months learning to fold and unfold, and it lifted him off his feet, and it carried him backward across the lab and into the cabinets, and the glass came down around them in a long, bright rain. Doris on the table did not wake. The serum was good for that, at least. She slept through her own near murder and the murder of her would-be murderer both, and I want you to know that she lived, because I am going to skip ahead a moment to tell you. She lived. We got her out. She does not know what was almost done to her in that room. I have never told her. I will not tell her. There are some things a person does not need to carry. But what I need to tell you about is what happened in the next 4 minutes. Because in the next 4 minutes, I did the only thing in my life I am still proud of. The thing had Bill against the cabinets and it was working on him. I will not describe what it was doing. I will tell you only that the Vrith do not believe a body is dead until it stops screaming, and Bill was still screaming and the thing was being thorough. I had a choice in front of me. I could run. The elevator was 8 steps away. I had the keys. I could ride up to the surface and lock the shaft behind me and seal Bill and Jan and the thing in the bunker forever and walk out into the ash and take my chances with the blockade above. That was the choice a sensible man would have made. That was the choice almost any man would have made. I did not make it. I want to tell you it was courage. It was not. It was Jan. Jan was still in the pan, and Jan was screaming, and Jan was a woman who had asked me 9 days running to kill her, and I had not, and I owed her a debt I had not yet been willing to look at, and the debt had come due. I was not going to leave her down there with the thing. Not alive. Not the kind of alive she was. I went for the rig. The rig was Bill's transfer apparatus, the thing he had built to move ahead from one body to another, the thing he had brought Doris down to use. It was bolted to the prep table. It had a power cell the size of a fuel drum and a discharge coil meant to ground the patient during the cut. The coil was not a weapon. It was a medical instrument, but I am a sapper, and a sapper looks at a medical instrument and sees a charge. I unhooked the coil from the table with my one good hand and my teeth. I dragged it across the floor by its lead. I set it down 10 feet from where the thing was working on Bill, and I keyed the discharge to manual, and I waited. The thing finished with Bill. It dropped what was left of him on the floor, and it stood up and it turned its head, its long, wrong head, with the human jaw and the Vrith plates, and it looked at me, and I want to tell you I was not afraid, but I was. I was as afraid as I have ever been. I have been afraid in a lot of places. I have been afraid in a ditch with my arm cooking beside me. I have been afraid in a forward bunker with a Vrith feeder 40 feet away and 1 round in the magazine. I have never been afraid the way I was afraid of that thing in the lab, because that thing was not a Vrith and not a man and not anything I had a name for, and it was looking at me the way Bill had looked at Doris on the table, which is to say, the way a buyer looks at a piece of equipment. I waited until it took 1 step toward me, then I keyed the discharge. The coil went off like a small star. It threw me backward into the wall. It blew every light in the room. It took the thing off its feet and slammed it into the far cabinet, and the cabinet came down on top of it, and the serum lines feeding it from the back room. Because of course it was still running on Bill's serum. Of course the thing had patched itself into the supply. The serum lines went up in a long blue burn that smelled like copper and meat. The thing thrashed for a long time under the cabinet. I do not know how long. I lay against the wall with the wind out of me and the stump of my arm aching for the first time in months, really aching, the way it had ached in the ditch outside Falter Creek, and I watched the thing die, and I watched it not die, and I watched it die again, and I waited. When it finally went quiet, the only sound in the lab was Jan in the pan, breathing slow. I crawled to her. I do not remember standing. I crawled across the floor on 1 elbow and a knee. There was glass under me. I did not feel it then. I felt it later. When I got to the prep table, I pulled myself up on the leg of it with my one hand, and I looked into the pan, and Jan looked back at me, and she was crying without tears because the bellows did not give her tears, and she said, "Kurt, please." I said, "I know." I said, "I am sorry it took me this long." The serum line ran into the base of her neck through a coupling Bill had designed himself. It was a clever coupling. It was meant to be hard to disconnect by accident. It had a safety on it. I knew the safety. I had cleaned it every morning for 9 days. I put my one good hand on the safety, and I looked at Jan, and Jan looked at me, and she said, very quietly, "Tell William. Tell his father." I said I would. I disconnected the line. She did not die quickly. The serum had been doing too much work in her for too long. She faded the way a lamp fades, the color going out of her first, then the focus in her eyes, then the small involuntary movements of her mouth. It took, I think, 4 minutes. I held the side of the pan with my one hand for all 4 of them. I did not look away. I had looked away enough that week. I did not say anything either. She had asked me to do a thing, and I did not want to muddy it with words. When she was gone, I sat down on the floor next to the prep table, and I think I slept. I do not know for how long. When I woke up, the lab was full of red emergency light, and the elevator alarm was sounding, and old William Courtner was standing in the doorway with 2 security men behind him and a sidearm in his hand, and he was looking at his son's body on the floor, and at the thing under the cabinet, and at me beside the pan, and his face was the face of a man who had at last seen the thing he had been afraid of for 2 years. I told him what had happened. I told him all of it. I did not leave anything out. I told him about Doris on the table and the drink Bill had put down for her. I told him about Roxanne and Donna and the list Bill had been keeping. I told him about Mancini coming down the elevator and what he had said. I told him about Jan and the thing and the Hive sense between them and the 9 days of conversation through a sealed steel door. I told him I should have stopped it sooner. I told him I had not. He listened the way old surgeons listen, which is to say, with his whole body without moving. When I finished, he stood there for a long time, and then he said, "And my son, at the end, did he understand what he had done?" I told him I did not know. I told him I thought Bill had stopped understanding things some weeks before. I told him I was sorry. He did not answer. He turned to the security men, and he told them in a quiet, steady voice to seal the lab and to burn the back room and to take the woman on the prep table, Doris, still sleeping, still alive, up to the surface infirmary, and to log her as a survivor of a Vrith incursion in the lower levels. The men did not argue. Old William Courtner was a senior surgeon of the Colony Medical Board, and his word in that bunker was a kind of law, and he had just lost his only son, and they were not going to argue with him. He looked at me last. He said, "And you, Kurt, what do I do with you?" I said, "Whatever you decide, sir." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You disconnected her line." I said, "Yes." He said, "Good, he would not have. I am glad it was you." That was the last thing William Courtner ever said to me. He died 3 weeks later in the second wave of the Vrith ground assault. They came down out of the cloud cover in numbers we had not expected, and the bunker took a direct strike from one of their cutting beams, and old William was in the upper infirmary tending burn cases, and the upper infirmary was where the beam came through. I was below ground at the time. I survived. I have survived a great many things I did not deserve to survive. I have made my peace with that mostly. It still wakes me up sometimes. Detective Mancini lived through the ground assault. He came to see me after. He sat across from me in a small room with a metal table, and he took out his notebook, and he set it down on the table, and he did not open it. He looked at me for a long moment, and he said, "You did not stop him." I said, "No, sir." He said, "You stopped it in the end." I said, "Not in time." He said, "No, not in time, but in the end." He looked at the closed notebook on the table. He looked at me. He said, "I am not going to write any of this down. The colony does not need the story. The colony needs the war over. Old William asked me to come and tell you that there will be no file. There will be no record. Doris is up and walking, and she does not know. Roxanne and Donna are alive. Lady Marmalade has gone off-world. The bunker is sealed. There is nothing for anyone to find. He paused. I am also not going to tell you that you are forgiven. That is not for me to say. I am only going to tell you that the colony does not have any more men to spare, and you are still a man more or less, and there is work that needs doing, and if you want it, you can have it. I took the work. I have been a quiet man in quiet jobs ever since. Mancini and I were friends in the careful way men in our line become friends for 19 years until he died in his sleep on a colony 3 jumps further out. I went to his funeral. I stood at the back. I did not speak. I did not need to. He had already said what he needed to say to me in that small room with the metal table, and I had spent the rest of his life trying to be the man he had seen when he had decided not to write any of it down. I want to finish by telling you what I learned, because the men who write the histories of this war will not tell you, and I think it should be on the record from someone who was there. The Vrith lost. You know that. Everyone knows that. The blockade broke in the 3rd year and the fleet came in from the deeper systems, and the Hive collapsed in on itself once we figured out how to cut the signal that held it together. The histories will tell you it was the orbital strikes that did it, or the new munitions, or the breakthrough at the Xeno research labs on the inner worlds. The histories will be partly right. They will also be missing something, and the missing thing is this. The Vrith did not understand us. They never did. They understood our biology. They understood it better than we did in some ways because they had been opening us up for years, but they did not understand the shape of us. They believed a body was not dead until it stopped screaming. They believed that as long as a thing kept making noise, it was still meat, still in process, still theirs. They built their whole logic of harvest on the assumption that a screaming thing was a thing that wanted to live. They had never met a human who would scream all the way through her own death and mean every second of it as a no. Jan screamed at Bill for 9 days. She screamed at him while he kept her alive against her will. She screamed at him with the only voice he had given her, and she used that voice to call the thing through the wall, and when the thing came, she did not stop. She kept screaming the whole way through what happened to him. She was still screaming when I disconnected her line, and she did not stop screaming until her cords gave out, and even then I think, and I cannot prove this, but I think she went on screaming somewhere the Vrith could still hear her, because the thing in the back room was a Vrith. The thing in the back room was a Vrith that had been kept alive on human serum and stitched together with human tissue for 2 months, and the thing in the back room was on the Hive sense. The thing in the back room felt everything Jan felt for 9 days, and the thing in the back room sent it home. I did not know that then. I learned it later when the Xeno teams came in after the war and went through Bill's bunker and put the pieces together. They told me, in a clean office on a clean world, that the Vrith Hive had begun to fracture in the weeks after the bunker incident. They told me that the Vrith on our front had started making mistakes, that they had begun, of all things, to hesitate over screaming bodies. They told me that the signal that came out of our colony in those weeks had been studied by every xenologist alive, and that the best read on it was that the thing in the back room had transmitted something the Hive did not have a category for. The thing had transmitted 9 days of a woman who would not stop saying no. The thing had transmitted 9 days of a human being who refused, with her last working tissue, to be alive on the terms she had been handed. The Hive had heard her. And the Hive had begun, in some small, slow way, to come apart. The Xeno officer who briefed me, a woman with gray at her temples and a notebook of her own, asked me, at the end, if I had any sense at the time of what we were doing down there. I told her no. I told her I had been a one-armed sapper in a hole in the ground, and I had been keeping a basin clean, and I had not understood anything for most of those 9 days. She nodded as if that was the answer she had expected. Then she said, Mr. Kurt. The Vrith built their war on the assumption that a body in pain was a body that would eventually consent to be opened. They had been right about every other species they had ever met. They had never met one of us. They did not know that a human being could be in absolute pain and still refuse. She closed her notebook. Your fiancée's friend taught them. The cost was very high, but she taught them. I did not correct her on the word fiancé. I did not have it in me. Jan had not been my fiancé. Jan had been Bill's. Jan had been, at the end, the woman whose line I disconnected on the 9th day because she had asked me to and because no one else in that room was going to. I do not know what that makes me to her in the long account. I do not think there is a word for it. I have stopped looking for one. The histories will not put it like that. The histories will say the war was won by ships and guns. The histories will be right enough. But I was there, and I am telling you what I saw, and what I saw is that a woman in a basin broke something in the enemy that no fleet ever touched. She did it by being human in a way the Vrith could not afford to understand. She did it by being so absolutely unwilling to be what they thought she was that the broadcast of her unwillingness, riding home on the back of a stolen Vrith nervous system, sat in the hive mind and ate it from the inside. I have thought about this for a long time. I have thought about it on long nights and short ones. I have thought about it when the stump of my arm aches and I cannot sleep. I have thought about it most when I think of Bill, because Bill is the part of the story I cannot make clean. Bill loved her. Bill killed her, and then he killed her again by refusing to let her go, and then he was going to kill another woman for her, and the thing in the back room killed him for it. I do not know if Bill was a good man who went wrong or a bad man who hid it well. I do not think it matters anymore. He was my friend. He pulled me out of a ditch. He was also a man who put a woman's head in a pan and told her he loved her while she begged to die. Both of those things are true. Both of them will be true for as long as I am alive to remember. I live now in a small house on a colony you have not heard of, on a quiet world the Vrith never reached. I have one arm as I have always had since Falter Creek. I keep a garden. I do not eat meat. The smell of it still puts me back in that lab. I do not have a wife, and I do not have children, and I do not have many friends. And I am all right with that, because I do not think I am owed those things, and because I have a thing I am owed instead, which is the memory of a woman in a basin who looked at me on the 9th day and said please, and a man who finally said yes. I will tell you the last thing she said to me, and then I will stop. She said, "Tell William, tell his father." She meant tell him that his son had loved her and had loved her wrongly, and had loved her into the kind of death no body should be asked to survive. She meant tell him I did not blame him. She meant tell him I went out angry but not at him. She meant a great many things in those 4 words, and I told old William every one of them in the half hour between when he found me on the floor and when he went up to the infirmary to die. I have told it again now, to you, because old William is gone and there is no one else to tell. I held a woman's head in a stainless pan for 9 days while the sky outside kept screaming. On the 9th day I let her go. The enemy that took our world is dead now, and we are not, and the histories will say it was the fleet, and the fleet will believe them. But I know what I saw. I know what came out of that basin on the 9th day, riding home on a stolen nerve, into the heart of the thing that thought it understood us. It did not understand us. It never could have.